When I first stumbled across a collection of faded photographs from the 1840s, I thought I was looking at typical historical documentation. Street scenes from major cities, construction workers, urban development projects. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the more I examined these images, the more something felt fundamentally wrong. Workers weren't building up, they were digging down. Entire city blocks showed people excavating around buildings that were already standing. And strangest of all, these buildings had windows and doorways that disappeared below ground level, as if someone had dumped massive amounts of earth around structures that were never meant to be buried. What I discovered next changed everything I thought I knew about the mid-19th century, because between 1840 and 1880, something extraordinary happened across the globe. Cities from London to San Francisco, from St. Petersburg to Melbourne, all experienced the same phenomenon. Massive layers of mud and sediment appeared seemingly overnight, burying entire floors of buildings. The official story claims this was normal urban development, street-raising projects, drainage improvements, gradual modernization. But when you examine the evidence city by city, the official explanations crumble. These weren't isolated incidents spread across decades. They were synchronized events occurring within the same narrow time frame across continents that had no communication with each other. And the scale was unprecedented. We're talking about millions of tons of earth that appeared suddenly enough to bury first and sometimes second floors of active buildings. The photographs tell a story that historians refuse to acknowledge. In every major city affected, you see the same sequence. Buildings half buried in compacted earth, work crews with shovels and carts removing sediment by the ton, streets being rebuilt at higher elevations to accommodate the new ground level, and most tellingly, lower floors of buildings being permanently sealed and abandoned instead of restored. This wasn't gradual urban development. This was emergency excavation on a global scale. What makes this even more suspicious is the timing of when photography became widespread. The earliest daguerreotypes and photographs of these cities begin appearing right at the moment when these massive excavation projects were underway, almost as if someone wanted to document the recovery process while erasing any evidence of what came before. As I dove deeper into municipal records and engineering reports, a pattern emerged that mainstream historians have never adequately explained. The buildings being excavated weren't crude structures from an earlier era. They displayed architectural sophistication that supposedly didn't exist in the early 1800s. Massive stone arches buried underground. Foundations extending far deeper than any blueprints indicated. Masonry work so precise that even modern engineers struggle to understand how it was accomplished. And here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. The architectural style of these buried structures was remarkably consistent across continents. Buildings in Chicago showed the same design elements as structures being excavated in Vienna. Construction techniques discovered in Boston matched those found beneath St. Petersburg. This wasn't coincidence. This was evidence of a widespread architectural tradition that had been systematically buried and forgotten. The more I researched, the more I encountered references to something called Tartaria. Not the sensationalized internet theories you might have heard, but quiet mentions in official documents. Engineering reports describing foundations that predated official city planning, geological surveys noting masonry of unknown origin, council minutes referencing structures older than recorded history. These weren't dramatic claims, they were bureaucratic footnotes, brief acknowledgements that the buildings being excavated didn't match the accepted timeline of urban development, and then these references would disappear from subsequent reports, as if someone had decided they were too dangerous to mention. The photographic evidence supports something far more extraordinary than simple urban modernization. Workers in Paris removing earth from around perfectly intact stone arches. Crews in San Francisco excavating elaborate underground chambers. Teams in Warsaw uncovering corridors that extended far beyond the footprints of the buildings above them. But here's what makes this truly suspicious. In every single case, the excavation stopped at a certain point. Cities removed just enough earth to restore street access, but left entire underground levels permanently buried. Why would you leave structurally sound floors underground if your goal was urban improvement? Why not restore these buildings to their original height? The answer becomes clear when you examine what was being hidden. The buried architecture consistently showed characteristics that didn't belong to the mid-1800s. Advanced engineering techniques, massive-scale construction, precision stonework that required tools and knowledge supposedly unavailable to builders of that era. Someone made a deliberate decision to bury this evidence rather than study it, and that decision was coordinated across multiple continents simultaneously. The scale of these operations defies conventional explanation. We're talking about cities that were politically unstable, economically struggling, or recovering from conflicts. Yet somehow they all managed to mobilize tens of thousands of workers, move millions of tons of earth, and rebuild entire districts within the same 30-year window. Without proper documentation, without public explanation, without acknowledging what they were really doing. This wasn't random urban development. This was a coordinated response to something that had buried these cities in the first place. The official narrative claims these were street-raising projects necessitated by drainage problems and urban planning needs, but the evidence tells a different story. The sediment layers were too uniform, the burial depths too consistent, the architectural discoveries too advanced, and the timing too synchronized to be explained by natural flooding or gradual urban decay. Something catastrophic had buried these cities. And the mid-1800s excavation projects weren't construction efforts. They were recovery operations designed to dig out and repurpose the remains of a previous civilization. The photographic record shows workers removing earth, not adding it. The engineering reports describe discovering rooms and chambers, not building them. The municipal documents reference unexpected foundations and unmapped corridors, not planned construction projects. Yet within decades, this massive undertaking was rewritten as routine modernization. The buried floors were explained away as basements. The advanced stonework was attributed to Roman or medieval influences. The coordinated timing was dismissed as coincidence. But the evidence remains hidden in plain sight. Photographs of half-buried buildings, maps showing elevation changes that don't match natural topography. Engineering reports describing discoveries that contradict official timelines, and architectural features that suggest a level of sophistication that wasn't supposed to exist in the early 19th century. The story of what happened between 1840 and 1880 isn't just about urban development. It's about the systematic erasure of evidence that doesn't fit our accepted version of history. Evidence of advanced architecture that was deliberately buried rather than studied. Evidence of a global catastrophe that was rewritten as routine modernization. And the most unsettling part: this wasn't an accident. The consistency across continents, the synchronized timing, the similar excavation techniques, and the coordinated cover-up all point to something far more organized than random urban planning. Someone knew what lay beneath these cities. Someone directed the recovery operations, and someone made the decision to bury the evidence again rather than reveal what had been discovered. What we're looking at isn't just a cover-up. It's evidence of something that challenges the fundamental timeline we've been taught about human civilization. Because when you start connecting the dots between these excavation sites, when you trace the patterns of what was buried and what was preserved, a disturbing picture emerges. The architectural style that kept appearing beneath these cities wasn't primitive. It wasn't crude early industrial construction. It was sophisticated, massive, and built to last millennia. Stone blocks fitted so precisely that you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. Arches spanning distances that required engineering knowledge supposedly unknown in that era. Foundation systems designed to support structures far larger than anything built on top of them. And here's what really troubled me as I dug deeper into the records. The people doing the excavating in the 1840s and 1850s had no idea what they were uncovering. Their notes describe surprise at finding rooms where rooms weren't supposed to exist, confusion about discovering corridors that extended beyond mapped boundaries, bewilderment at stone carving techniques that didn't match anything in their experience. These weren't archaeologists carefully documenting ancient ruins. These were city workers trying to restore street access who kept stumbling across evidence of something they couldn't explain. And their supervisors kept telling them to just dig around it, seal it up, and move on. The municipal records from this period are filled with strange inconsistencies. Budgets for earth removal that don't match the reported amounts of soil moved. Work crews assigned to projects that officially didn't exist. Materials purchased for construction that never appeared in final building plans. And most tellingly, gaps in documentation during the exact periods when the most significant discoveries were being made. In Chicago, workers reported uncovering stone chambers 3 stories beneath street level. The official response was to fill them with concrete and pretend they'd never been found. In Vienna, excavation teams discovered a network of tunnels that connected buildings across multiple city blocks. Those tunnels were immediately sealed and their existence denied in subsequent reports. The pattern repeated itself across every major city affected. Discovery, documentation, and then deliberate concealment. As if there was a coordinated effort to ensure that whatever was being uncovered would never be properly studied or understood. But the most revealing evidence comes from the photography itself. Early daguerreotypes show something that modern viewers rarely notice because we've been conditioned to see these images as normal historical documentation. But look closer at the proportions. The buildings being excavated around are massive, not just tall, but built on a scale that dwarfs the people working around them. Window openings that required ladders to reach. Doorways designed for something much larger than average human height. Stone blocks that took multiple men just to shift slightly. This wasn't architecture built for the people who lived in these cities in the 1800s. This was architecture built for a different world entirely. And the most unsettling detail of all appears in photographs taken after the excavation work was completed. The newly constructed buildings and street improvements look crude and temporary compared to what was being dug out from underneath. As if the people rebuilding these cities were working with primitive tools and limited knowledge compared to whoever had built the original structures. The contrast is stark in every image. Ancient stonework that looks like it could stand for another 1,000 years next to hasty brick repairs that were already showing wear within decades. Precise geometric patterns carved into buried foundations next to rough mortarwork slapped together above ground. It's as if 2 completely different civilizations were represented in the same excavation site. This raises uncomfortable questions about continuity. If the people rebuilding these cities in the 1850s were the descendants of whoever built the original structures, why was there such a dramatic difference in capability? Why did they treat these discoveries as foreign artifacts rather than inherited architecture? The answer appears in the silence surrounding these findings. Because once you trace the timeline carefully, once you map out exactly when these excavations were happening, and when documentation about them stopped appearing in public records, a clear pattern emerges. The discoveries were being actively suppressed. Reports were being edited or withdrawn. Photographs were being archived rather than published. And the workers who made the most significant finds were being reassigned to different projects or different cities entirely. Someone with significant authority was orchestrating this cover-up. Someone who understood that what was being uncovered threatened the accepted narrative of urban development and historical progression. Someone who had the power to coordinate identical responses across multiple governments and different continents simultaneously. The evidence for this coordination is overwhelming once you know what to look for. Similar excavation techniques being employed in cities that had no direct communication. Identical decisions about which structures to preserve and which to bury again. Matching timelines for when work began and when documentation ceased. And most tellingly, the same architectural elements being discovered and concealed in location after location. The oversized arches, the impossibly precise stonework, the foundation systems that extended far deeper than any recorded blueprints, the geometric patterns that appeared in Berlin, Boston, and Budapest, despite these cities supposedly having completely different architectural traditions. This wasn't coincidence. This was evidence of a previous civilization whose remnants were scattered across the globe. A civilization that had built on a scale and with a sophistication that didn't fit the timeline we've been taught about human development. The mud that buried these structures wasn't the result of poor drainage or gradual environmental change. It was the result of something catastrophic. Something that happened suddenly enough to preserve entire building complexes intact beneath layers of sediment. Something that left behind evidence of advanced engineering buried under every major city affected. And the recovery operations of the 1840s weren't urban improvement projects. They were salvage operations designed to extract whatever could be repurposed while ensuring that the most challenging evidence remained hidden underground. The coordination required for this effort suggests planning and authority that extended far beyond local governments or individual cities. This was a systematic response to discoveries that threatened fundamental assumptions about history, technology, and human capability. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. Despite decades of careful concealment, despite the systematic suppression of documentation, despite the coordinated effort to bury this evidence again, traces of the truth survived. The photographs that weren't destroyed tell their own story. Images tucked away in private collections, forgotten in municipal archives, misfiled in engineering departments, workers standing beside stone blocks that required teams of horses to move, excavation sites that revealed chambers extending far beyond what any official map indicated. Construction crews looking confused as they uncovered architectural features that didn't match anything in their training. These surviving images show something that challenges everything we think we know about the capabilities of earlier civilizations. Stone-cutting techniques that produce surfaces so smooth they appear almost polished. Joint work so precise that centuries of burial hadn't created even hairline gaps. Structural engineering that supported massive loads without the steel reinforcement that modern construction requires. But perhaps the most revealing photographs are the ones showing the aftermath. Streets rebuilt at higher elevations, creating an artificial ground level that buried the lower portions of buildings permanently. New construction layered on top of older foundations, but never matching the scale or precision of what lay beneath. Facades modified to hide the fact that what appeared to be ground floor windows were actually second or third story openings. The transformation was systematic and thorough. Entire city districts were essentially rebuilt from the ground up, but not in the way urban planners typically approach development. This was archaeological concealment disguised as modernization. Municipal records from the period reveal the true scope of what was happening. Purchase orders for massive quantities of filled dirt and construction materials that don't correspond to any documented building projects. Work contracts for excavation teams that operated for months without producing any official reports about what they found. Budget allocations for projects that were never publicly announced or explained to city residents. The financial records alone tell a remarkable story. Cities that were struggling economically suddenly found resources to fund excavation projects that employed thousands of workers for years. Where did this funding come from? How did politically unstable governments coordinate such massive undertakings simultaneously? The conventional explanations about street improvement and drainage projects don't account for the enormous expense involved. Engineering reports from the period contain details that mainstream historians prefer to ignore. Descriptions of stonework that didn't match known construction techniques. Measurements of foundations that extended far deeper than necessary for the buildings above them. Documentation of chambers and corridors that appeared to be part of much larger structural systems. These weren't crude cellars or simple storage spaces. The descriptions consistently referenced sophisticated engineering, ventilation systems that still functioned after being buried for decades, water management infrastructure that was more advanced than anything being built at the time, structural supports designed for loads that far exceeded what the surface buildings required. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you examine what happened to the workers who made these discoveries. Personnel records show unusual transfers and reassignments, experienced excavation crews being broken up and sent to different projects. Foremen who asked too many questions being replaced with supervisors who followed orders without investigation. The message was clear. Document what you find, but don't ask what it means. Extract what can be repurposed, but don't study what can't be explained. And above all, don't discuss your findings with anyone outside the immediate work crew. This level of control suggests coordination that extended beyond individual city governments. Someone with significant authority was managing these operations across multiple countries and different political systems. Someone who understood that what was being uncovered posed a threat to accepted historical narratives. The architectural consistency across continents provides the strongest evidence for this coordination. Building techniques discovered in Prague matched those found in Philadelphia. Structural systems uncovered in Turin resembled those excavated in Toronto. Artistic elements buried beneath Budapest appeared in identical form under buildings in Birmingham. This wasn't cultural influence or trade relationships explaining similar architectural styles. This was evidence of a unified civilization whose remnants were being systematically uncovered and concealed across the globe. The stonework itself defies explanation using conventional historical timelines. Blocks weighing multiple tons fitted together with tolerances that modern machinery struggles to achieve. Surfaces finished to standards that require industrial tools, supposedly invented centuries later. Geometric precision that suggests mathematical knowledge far in advance of what educational records indicate existed in earlier periods. Yet the people excavating these structures in the 1840s treated them as foreign artifacts. There was no recognition, no cultural memory, no inherited knowledge about how these buildings had been constructed. The workers approached each discovery as if encountering the remains of a completely different civilization. This disconnect between the sophistication of what was being uncovered and the primitive methods being used to excavate it reveals something profound about historical continuity. If these buried structures represented the architectural heritage of the people living in these cities, why was there no knowledge about their construction? Why did every discovery come as a surprise? The answer emerges when you examine the timeline more carefully. The buildings being excavated weren't simply old. They were from before the accepted historical record, before the established timeline of urban development, before the narrative that places these cities as products of gradual growth and conventional architectural evolution. The evidence scattered across dozens of cities tells a story that academic institutions refuse to acknowledge. Photographs that document excavation rather than construction. Municipal records that describe discovery rather than planning. Architectural features that predate the supposed builders by centuries. What happened between 1840 and 1880 wasn't urban modernization. It was the systematic recovery and concealment of a previous world whose existence challenges everything we've been taught about human civilization. The coordinated nature of these operations, the identical responses across continents, and the deliberate suppression of documentation all point to an organized effort to control historical narrative. The buried cities they tried to erase still exist beneath our feet. Every major metropolitan area affected during this period contains layers of advanced architecture that mainstream archaeology refuses to study. The evidence remains, waiting in sealed chambers, blocked corridors, and foundation systems that extend far deeper than official blueprints indicate. This isn't speculation. This isn't theory. This is documented history that's been rewritten as routine urban development. The photographs exist, the municipal records survive, the architectural evidence lies buried but intact beneath the cities we walk through every day. The question isn't whether this happened. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is why such enormous effort was invested in ensuring that we would never learn what our predecessors discovered when they dug beneath their streets and found proof of something that wasn't supposed to exist.